The OA was a Netflix original series that only ended up having 2 of its intended 5 seasons to tell its story, but the show was designed as an intricate puzzle that the audience is supposed to be able to solve, and with that in mind, we can very accurately predict where the story would have gone using its symbolism. This will be a more elaborate version of my previous mega video breaking down how all the seasons would have gone and how the series would have ended, with the intent of primarily revealing the final secret that I alluded to at the end of that last one, as well as to incorporate new clues I've since learned about the show, and from the new series from the creators Brit Marling and Zalbat Monglige, with Brit Marling also being the star of the OA. Season 1 introduced us to Prairie Johnson, who was previously known as Nina Azarova before being adopted from Russia by a couple in Crestwood, Maine. After going missing for 7 years, Prairie has returned to her hometown where she has rejected both her adoptive name and her birth name, now calling herself the OA. She refuses to tell the story of her kidnapping to her parents or the authorities, and instead gathers 4 high school boys and their teacher to tell the story to. OA claims that in the 7 years that she was missing, she had been held captive by a mad scientist named Hap. Hap was forcing her and the other captives to have near-death experiences, where he could record the brain information from when that dead person is revived in order to create an audio rendering of what that person seemed to experience on the other side. OA is played by Brit Marling, who is one of the 2 creators of the OA as previously mentioned, and Hap is played by Jason Isaacs, who is said to represent Zalbat Monglige, the co-creator of the OA who also helped write and direct the series, as well as previous projects that the 2 collaborated on. While being held prisoner, OA falls in love with a fellow captive of Hap, or Haptive, named Homer, and becomes friends with the others trapped in Hap's basement with them. Across the OA's story in Season 1, she reveals that there are 5 movements that she and the Haptives were being taught by beings from the other side, and when combined, these movements would open a portal to another dimension. While the Crestwood 5 are unsure if they should believe OA's story, they end up performing the movements in the Season 1 finale, with OA dying due to a gunshot at the same time. The season ends with us not just wondering if OA lied about her story, but it being painted that way entirely by the writers of the OA, with OA's story supposedly coming from a random assortment of books that the character was given after her captivity. Season 2, however, revealed that the movement seemingly did work, with OA jumping into the body of a version of herself in an alternate reality. This alternate reality is revealed to be a split in the timeline that OA originally came from, with Dimension 2's version of herself called Nina Azarova because she never had the near-death experience that OA had as a child, and thus never got adopted or renamed, let alone kidnapped by Hap. In this dimension, however, the other Haptives are still being held prisoner by Hap, who in this life is a world-renowned psychiatrist running an elite facility. Here, Homer is a young doctor who is working for Hap and who looks up to him, with the other Haptives being patients of Hap's. After abandoning her on the side of the road at the end of OA's story in Season 1, Hap took the other captives and forced them to perform the movements, making them jump into the bodies of their Dimension 2 counterparts, the same way OA jumped into the body of Dimension 2's version of her, Nina Azarova. This version of Hap seemed to be getting mixed up in dirty and shady dealings, making him pretty evil, but not quite as evil as the version of him in OA's story from Dimension 1. In this dimension, the other Haptives were likely real patients of his who conveniently became Hap's prisoners when he took over his Dimension 2 body, known there as Dr. Percy. The season had OA exploring a strange house that seemed to be connected to the multiverse, which is presented as a series of forking timelines all starting from a single point. At the end of the season, however, OA jumps to a 3rd dimension along with Hap and at least one of the others, but this new dimension is not just an alternate timeline. Here, OA has jumped into the body of actress Brit Marling, who is filming on the set of the OA. Hap likewise jumps into the body of Jason Isaacs, who in this world is a co-creator of the OA, making him the in-show parallel to Zalbat Monglige. The real-life Zalbat Monglige has even said in an interview that in this world, Brit Marling's father would not be the actor who played her father in Season 1, but that he would just be another actor that OA is unrelated to. From here, Dimension 1 and 2 both appear to be fictional realities imagined by Dimension 3's Brit Marling. Through the power of belief, she managed to give the tools to her imaginary characters that would allow them to jump into her reality, those tools being the 5 movements. But from here, what exactly would have happened next? It has been clearly stated in interviews that the OA was intended to have 5 seasons, though that seems obvious from the internal evidence in the show as well. The series as a whole has a strong focus on the number 5, particularly with the idea of 4 becoming 5. When OA is kidnapped, she's the 4th captive in Hap's bunker, with Hap being a 5th larger entity watching over them. The Crestwood Five are of course made up of 4 high school boys, and their much older teacher being the 5th watching over them. Even in OA's bedroom, we can see a setup of 4 dolls with one much larger doll watching over them. In her Season 1 NDE, Katoon tells OA that if she returns to her friends instead of dying, that the 5 of them will stop a great evil. OA claims there is only 4 of them, but Katoon claims that she just can't see what she means yet. Some take this to mean that the 5th one to help them is Hap, who will eventually become someone who helps them to stop the great evil. Others took it simply to mean Renata, who was kidnapped later, making 4 captives, with OA being the 5th greater entity guiding them. In Season 2, however, OA is only able to solve her problems when she embraces the different life that Nina Azarova lived in Dimension 2, and integrate with her so that they can become a more whole and complex being. This process across 4 seasons would lead to her becoming a 5th and more complete version of herself from the 4 dimensions preceding. Each season also starts the same way, ends the same way, and has a breaking open point near the end of Episode 4, which is the halfway point of the 8-episode seasons. Season 1 opens with OA waking up in a hospital bed after a near-death experience of jumping off of a bridge. Season 2 likewise opens with OA waking up in a hospital bed after jumping into the body of Dimension 2's Nina Azarova, causing a heart attack. Season 1 ends with Steve chasing the ambulance OA is in as it drives away, and Steve chases another ambulance containing the OA at the end of Season 2 after he has managed to jump all the way to Dimension 3. The midpoint of each season involves one character having a near-death experience, with just about 30 seconds of that character traveling to another dimension, with Homer traveling to Dimension 2 in Season 1 and OA traveling to Dimension 3 in Season 2. With each story having the same beginning, middle, and end, we can see that 5 seasons would have been the same story 5 times, the same cast, different play, as OA explained to BBA in Season 1. Season 3, 4, and 5 likewise would have followed this structure, but it also alludes to the structure of the series as a whole. The series is of course called the OA, with the O representing the loop that the OA appears to be trapped in. Not just the 5 loops of the 5 seasons, but the greater loop that they create when they connect. The A is stylized to not have its sides connect, and like with each season, there is a breaking point right in the middle. This breaking point severing the story in half also indicates that the second half of the story reflects the first half of the story, making the story of the OA a palindrome. These patterns seem to take heavy inspiration from the works of Madame Blavatsky. Madame Blavatsky was a famous 1800s psychic and esotericist known for her 2-part series, The Secret Doctrine. This is claimed to be an ancient doctrine predating all myths, which she then breaks down over the course of the 2 volumes to compare to the real myths of the world and explain their crazy supposed truths that they share. In this doctrine, she talks about how existence itself is a loop and a palindrome, with existence being an endless series of those loops, and humans being in a 4th era combining our 4 elements to create a new 5th one. The supposed ancient doctrine is seen as something she wrote herself and thus fake, but her information and resources behind it were undoubtedly very interesting. Blavatsky was attempting to take all of the different myths of the world, reconcile them against each other, and combine them into a story with the speculative science of the future, and share it with the world in a way that doesn't just give them information, but teaches them how to dissect text for its information. Marling and Batmanglish set out to do the same thing with the OA, telling their own narrative and going beyond the ideas that Blavatsky had alone, but trying to explain a lot of great truths. Blavatsky, thus, will be one of the many sources we use as we dissect the mystic and mythic elements of the OA story. This is proven by other clues within the show, such as the main violin theme that plays when the Crestwood Five are doing the movements in the cafeteria, and that OA plays on her own violin that ends up attracting Hap to her at the train station. When played in reverse, this song is almost exactly the same, and you can listen to it for yourself here on YouTube with the link in the description down below. The only real difference between the song and the song when played in reverse, other than the instruments sounding reverse themselves, is that the tone shifts in a different direction, but the notes themselves remain the same. This makes the song a musical palindrome and emphasizes how the second half of the story of the OA will reflect the first half, but how there will still be a growth, if you will, from one end to the other, the way a sunrise and a sunset reflect each other while having their differences. This loop and palindrome is also proved by the House on Nob Hill, which itself is a microcosm of the 5-season story of OA within Dimension 2, the same way that OA's story in Dimension 1 appears to be a short version of the greater 5-season narrative as well. The House on Nob Hill was well understood to represent the show, with it being presented as a puzzle that the creators want you to solve. The house is, at its core, a series of 5 puzzles, one for each of the seasons in the show. This becomes immediately clear with the first puzzle, which involves OA and Kareem needing to escape from a room with virtually no light, except for that coming from the closed door high above them. OA was blind within her story from Season 1, and thus learned how to navigate by feeling along walls, recognizing where every bump and change and piece of furniture is to let her know where she was and that she was on the right path. With that in mind, she feels along the walls and finds that there is a hard-to-see and very tiny staircase that they can climb to make their way to the exit. The second puzzle is a literal puzzle on the floor, mirroring how Season 2's focus was on the house itself, the giant puzzle. Its use of tree imagery illustrates how Season 2 is about how these 5 pieces of the puzzle connect, and also alludes to the idea that the multiverse is a series of branching timelines, all coming back to the same source, as believed from Season 2's lore. After the second puzzle, OA and Kareem are separated from each other, symbolizing how at the end of Season 2, OA goes on to Dimension 3, and Kareem is left behind. In this miniaturized inversion, however, it is OA who gets stuck after the second puzzle, and Kareem who goes on to the end, with his journey mirroring what would have been OA's journey in Seasons 3, 4, and 5 if it had not been cancelled. The third puzzle, representing the third season, is just a room with a bed in it, the question being how to advance forward. Kareem stops to rest for a moment and dreams of his death, after which he realizes there is a hidden door underneath the bed. This represents how Season 3 is not just the midpoint of the series, but the high point and the breaking open point as illustrated by the A and the OA's title, with the only way to move forward being to descend back downward into the house, back down into the puzzle, by traveling beneath the bed, representing descending into the dreams and fantasies of Dimension 3's Britt Marling as they return to a lower fictional dimension. As the middle point and seeming highest point, all the lower worlds would appear to be fictional stories told by people like Britt Marling in Dimension 3, with some of those other worlds being given the tools to eventually interfere with Dimension 3. The only way to continue the journey then is not to a world higher than Dimension 3, but one that is technically lower than it, another fantasy dimension created by Britt Marling, a world that would be a fictional TV or movie universe where almost anything can happen. The fourth puzzle is complex and involves different parts, though only one real puzzle is within it. The first phase is Kareem simply walking underground through a strange, dark, almost hellish-looking area, where what looks like dead bodies begin to come out of the dirt and grab at him. He runs, leading to the actual fourth puzzle, which is just a maze of mirrors, symbolizing how Season 4 begins the descent back down towards the other side of the palindrome, which reflects the first half of the story. This would make Dimension 4 a place that reflects Dimension 2, and like with the foreshadowing in the OA's violin theme, this would involve a sort of inversion of what we know and understand, and yet also a growth or tonal shift. The third phase Kareem goes through here is not another puzzle, but at the end of this maze, he finds Fola. For some reason, she is shown as an old woman, but when Kareem gets out of the house, he can clearly see that it is the same young woman he met earlier in the season, with that just being a hallucination from some gas. This again seems to hint at there being a sort of growth that is important to the story, while still reflecting the first half of the story, and is something that will be particularly important later when we discuss Season 4. With the fourth puzzle proving the palindrome, with it beginning the pattern of reflecting the previous seasons, Puzzle 5 proves that it is a loop, with it simply being a dead end with a T.S. Eliot quote that reads, "And the end of all our exploring will be to go back to where we started and know the place for the first time." After this, Kareem realizes that he can return to the beginning of the house, where he first, for a moment, thought that he saw another path that might lead up to the attic, and this time he can go straight there without having to bother with the puzzles, but it only being because of the puzzles that he understands the logic of the house, and because of that, his brain has become primed to accept the beautiful enlightenment when he opens the stained rose glass window, to understand the complexity of the multiverse without being pulled into it. This seems to represent how OA, after a dead end at the end of Season 4, will travel back in time to start the entire loop over, meaning Season 5 is not going to be a new dimension, but Dimension 1 again. This makes sense when we consider the pattern of the show we discussed before, which has a theme of 4 becoming 5. Returning to Dimension 1 with all 4 of her selves integrated would make her a complete 5th person. The OA is generally seen to stand for the original angel, with OA believing that she and the Haptives are angels that travel to other dimensions, and Katoon claiming OA is like her, but the original. The show is heavily influenced by mythology and spiritual school of thought from all over the world, with one of its key influences being Jewish Kabbalah. In Kabbalah, there are generally believed to be only 4 dimensions, of which there is one physical world, which is the material world that we inhabit. Then there are 3 higher dimensions that are more spiritual in nature, but aren't real. In Jewish Kabbalah, the 3rd dimension is called the world of creation, and thus in the OA, Dimension 3 masquerades as the most real dimension, the dimension that creates all of the others. But it's not the real world in the same way that Dimension 1 appears to be the physical reality of the OA. In Jewish Kabbalah, a 5th dimension is entirely hypothetical, something that only exists if you can imagine a world where those 4 worlds first came from, or a world that is all 4 of those worlds combined. This makes Season 5 in the OA a prequel that precedes the 4 seasons, but also one that only makes sense with the story of the first 4 behind it. In Season 1, the Crestwood Five, and really the audience as a whole, were purposely led to question and doubt OA's story by the writers, so that Season 5 could go back to the beginning and show us the truth of what really happened in the 7 years that the OA was supposedly kidnapped, and why she had to lie about certain parts of her story. With all that in mind, it's time to begin dissecting Seasons 3, 4, and 5 of the show sequentially, using all of these different patterns as well as more secrets to unravel how the series would have gone. As per the seasonal structure of the OA, Season 3 would begin with OA waking up in the hospital after her accident from the end of Season 2. Here, she would be examined and questioned like in the previous seasons, but this time she wouldn't be alone. She would have Hap in the body of Jason Isaacs there to talk for her. Hap warned OA that Dimension 3 would be a place where everyone calls her the OA, but that she doesn't call herself that. Thus, she would believe herself to just be Britt Marling, but everyone would know her as the OA because of her Netflix series. The OA forgetting herself was hinted at all the way back in Season 1, where it was explained that interdimensional travel often comes with amnesia, which we later learned was from the traveler taking on the memories of the new body that they traveled to. Not realizing they would leave their bodies behind and not wanting to forget the movements after they traveled, the OA carved the 1st and 3rd movement into her body, and Homer carved movements 2 and 4 into his. With Homer forgetting himself in Dimension 2 and OA foreshadowed to forget herself in Dimension 3, it would seem that Homer, or an aspect of him, would forget himself in Dimension 4 as well, and that OA had forgotten some aspect of herself in Dimension 1, but more on that later. Hap's goal thus far had been to understand how the universe works so he could get recognized for his contributions to science, but after thinking he understands the multiverse, he decides that he really wants to, yet again, capture the OA, this time in a lifestyle prison instead of in a glass cage. In Dimension 3, OA would trust Hap, thinking he is just her husband, with whom she also co-created the OA TV series with. The season would largely be about OA and Hap fighting over the future of the OA series, with Hap trying to paint himself as more of a good guy, believing in his motives to change the world through understanding it, even at the price of other people's suffering. Hap would want future dimensions to paint him in this way, as a man who is successful because of the science he has mastered and adored by the world. OA would instinctually fight against this, remembering the evil Hap that exists in her head, not wanting to see his character, which represents so much evil, becoming seen as some sort of inspiring role model after what he did to the Haptives. Hap's ideas about his character would likely play out in Season 4, but with an ironic twist, but more on that soon. One detail I had not discovered in my previous videos is how there has already been for several years an interview where Zalbat Manglij claimed that Season 3 of the OA would take heavy inspiration from Dial M for Murder. This is a classic Hitchcock film wherein a man discovers his wife is having an affair and tries to have her killed. This fails, with the assassin dying instead, and the husband eventually proven to be behind the entire thing. Fans have long speculated that this would be the real reason Britt Marling in Dimension 3 had her traumatic injury on set, with it being the Dimension 3 Jason Isaacs having set someone up to sabotage the cable so Britt Marling would fall. In the movie, the husband is ultimately proven guilty by the endless speculations of the wife's lover, which never quite get the story right, but which get close enough that a detective can figure out what really happened and hold the husband accountable. This would point to Homer as being the one who ends up proving Hap guilty in Dimension 3, being that younger person that OA so desperately loved in Dimension 1 who is coming between her and Hap, with this pattern being reflected in Dimension 3. Hap, having suppressed his Dimension 3 memories, would have no idea that he had sabotaged the cables, and would spend all season denying it and trying to cover his tracks because he just wants to live a life with OA now, trying to make up for the mistakes of Jason Isaacs, which he would still find a reason to blame on OA, of course, because of that affair. Now, the OA as a show is referred to by its creators as a maze or labyrinth, and Season 3, as the middle of the story, is the center of that maze. The middle of the story where things are their most balanced before we start descending back down into the reflected dimensions, where everything will look similar but different. As a reflection, that would mean we would ultimately see inversions of Dimension 2 and then 1 in Seasons 4 and then 5. Earlier, I noted that Hap seemed to be less evil in Dimension 2 than he was in Dimension 1, while still being evil, and in Dimension 3, it would make sense that the OA and Hap are perfectly balanced in this dimension. However, with Jason Isaacs being willing to commit such a dark act, that simply means that Britt Marling in this dimension would also be able to make nearly as big a betrayal. In Dimension 3, they are not just husband and wife, but co-creators of the show The OA, starring in it together as well. As the series progressed, if Britt Marling had an affair with another star, Jason Isaacs would not just feel betrayed in his marriage, but in his career, with more and more attention going to the actor for Homer as his role becomes more noble through the lens of Britt Marling, and Hap becomes more of a villain. He felt his career was being sabotaged, and he would decide to sabotage everyone else's in return. In the end, I think OA will survive the season, not just as the heroine in Dial M for Murder did, but I think Hap will end up murdering someone else instead. He has killed off various Haptives in different ways in lower dimensions, but to kill an actor in Dimension 3 would have seemingly catastrophic effects on all of the lower worlds. If each fictional story is its own dimension with people modeled after the actors who play them in Dimension 3, then killing off that actor could not just kill that person in multiple other timelines, but it would prevent them from being used to create new timelines or to continue stories in the same timeline, which will be very important later. If Homer, for instance, was killed in Dimension 3, he would have no actor who could play him in Dimension 4 to continue the story. This would be an ultimate final death that the Homer as OA knew him could never actually return from. This is the great evil Katoon seemed to warn about back in Season 1, an evil that has escaped the lower dimensions from within the human mind that can now wreak havoc on all the realities with how he writes future stories and with who he personally kills in that dimension. This is the great mission that OA is ultimately on, and the evil that she will have to stop when she reawakens to her mission as foreshadowed by Old Night. This is a moment OA experiences in her NDE wherein she will wake up to remember who she really is and return to that mission. In Season 1, when Homer traveled in his NDE, he went through a tunnel first, but seemed to fall into the body of a random patient that ran around the asylum on Treasure Island. We know that he didn't fall into his own body because in Season 2, OA points out the moment in Dr. Roberts' office where Homer is supposedly crawling through the ceiling. And it is Dr. Roberts' hand that reaches up into the air vents for Homer to see in his NDE in Season 1. When Homer falls through the ceiling, he does enter a body, however, as he is chased in the NDE by real people, and in Season 2, the secretary comes to tell Dr. Roberts that his patient is causing problems. In Season 2, when Old Night kills OA, she seems to travel through a tunnel and into the body of a woman using a restroom on a plane, but OA still sees herself as her Dimension 2 self. When she leaves the bathroom, we can see Netflix is playing on some of the screens around the plane, indicating that this is Dimension 3, where the OA is just a Netflix series. OA approaches a short-haired woman, who in the Season 2 finale we know to be Britt Marling with her short haircut. The NDE ends just as Britt Marling is about to turn around, and by the logic of Homer's NDE, that means Britt Marling will continue this interaction in Season 3. This is important because all throughout Season 3, Britt Marling will be questioning her identity, thinking that she might actually be the OA, but not having any proof until this moment. Since this moment on the airplane was something she wrote into Season 2 of her popular Netflix series, it coming to life in Dimension 3 would prove to Britt Marling that she really is the OA, that she wrote something that came to life. Not just that moment, but all of her characters, and that the woman piloting the body walking up to her was actually herself from Dimension 2. This person would likely come out of their random trance-like wandering once OA left their body back in Season 2 and not realize that they had wandered away from their normal seat. But with Britt Marling have turned around, this person would likely recognize her from the TV series. This random person would ask, "Wait, aren't you the OA?" And after a whole season of insisting that she is not the OA, that she is just Britt Marling, the creator of the OA, she would this time respond saying that yes, she is the OA. And in remembering who she really is, she would also realize who Jason Isaacs really is, Hap, and that she has to do something to stop him, having reawakened to her mission. After the death of a character such as Homer in Dimension 3, OA realizes that the only way to stop Hap from causing more damage would be to take him down to a lower world, to a world where his damage is restricted not just to that world, but where he can also be trapped inside the memories of a different version of himself. All of Season 3, Hap would have been trying to promote his character as an eventual hero, cryptically foreshadowing Season 4, the same way Season 3 was foreshadowed by Elodie and Scott, who gave hints at what to expect in the season to come. As Jason Isaacs, Hap would be slowly putting out his ideas and thoughts on where the show was going all season, creating a sort of Gary Stu perfect version of himself he believed to be worthy of praise, where he was an elite scientist that could change the world. This would be the perfect prison to insert Hap's consciousness into, a fantasy where he is the hero that everyone worships. In Dimension 1, OA is presented as her purest self, with Season 2 having her be a bit more loose with what OA considers to be her morals from Dimension 1, making it hard to integrate with Nina Azarova. In Dimension 3, she'd be capable of some pretty intense betrayal if the Dial M for murder theory has been correctly applied. In Dimension 4, it would be the darkest version of OA yet, one partially written by Hap to portray her as more subservient likely, and perhaps more difficult to deal with. The version of OA traveling across the dimensions would also become the darkest version of herself yet, as she has to keep up that role in Dimension 4, playing a character that traps Hap in that dimension and not being able to reveal who she really is, trapping him in the memories of this character the way Hap trapped OA in the memories of Dimension 3's Britt Marling. Additional evidence for all of these particular Dimension 4 theories comes from the latest show from Zalbat Monglige and Britt Marling called A Murder at the End of the World. This show was theorized by fans to allude to Seasons 3 and 4 of the OA, with Season 4 being understood to be another TV dimension in the original show. Well, A Murder at the End of the World is ultimately its own show with a self-contained story that you don't need to watch the OA to understand or appreciate. The direct parallels to the OA have made fans speculate that, at the very least, we are meant to take some hints from this show about what would have happened in Dimensions 3 and 4 of the OA, with it being understood that Season 4 of the OA would have been another fictional TV show type dimension written by Britt Marling in Dimension 3, and thus the real-life Britt Marling is able to write some hints into her new real-life show for us to dissect. At the end of the season even, Britt Marling's character says, "I know you'll find me," as her final words, which mirrors her last words in Season 2, which were, "You come find me." Since the cancellation of the show, this has become a phrase meant to echo how the audience has to come find the truth for themselves, and here, once again, indicates that there are clues to Season 4 of the OA without the story in A Murder at the End of the World being its entirety. Similar to the seasons of the OA, this show featured a Hap-type character named Andy Ronson, who many fans noticed looks similar to Jason Isaacs. In A Murder at the End of the World, Andy is exactly the kind of character that Hap would imagine himself as. He is a wealthy Elon Musk-type billionaire genius who is trying to save the world with his great mind, but feels that humanity has already doomed itself. Like the real-life Jason Isaacs, this character even has an English accent, and as per my theory from before, this Hap-like character masquerades as being a hero to the world, but is ultimately extremely controlling and self-serving. As his life unravels, he begins to blame everyone around him, seeing everyone as jealous of his genius and talent and trying to sabotage him, including his own wife. In the show, Britt Marling plays the wife of Andy, similar to how Britt Marling would have been the wife of Hap in Dimension 3. The main character of this show is actually Darby Hart, an amateur hacker and sleuth who is invited to Andy's retreat along with other geniuses from around the world who Andy believes could help save humanity from the upcoming climate catastrophes. In the very first episode, Darby is in front of a sign that says 401, which some fans speculate to be a reference to how this is a sort of mirror to what would have happened in Season 4, Episode 01 of the OA. The most direct reference to the OA comes from Episode 5 of A Murder at the End of the World, where Darby and 4 others sit around a campfire at the center of the retreat on seats that are arranged like a 5-sided pentagon, similar to the prison OA and the Haptives are trapped in her story from Season 1. While sitting here, Darby is surrounded by 4 others, making for a total of 5, just like the 5 Haptives. It's hard not to recognize the resemblance here of Darby to Steve, as well as between this other character Oliver and French, giving the impression that these are this world's version of the Crestwood 5, reflected versions of themselves from Dimension 2, but also older, as Kareem's hallucinations of the older Fola would imply. If Hap really did kill even just one actor like Homer in Dimension 3, OA may have realized that the only way to have Homer exist again would be in a new form in a new story. This seems to be the story of A Murder at the End of the World, with Marling's character becoming pregnant and giving birth to a child that is not truly Andy's, but who he obsesses over being the father of. Marling is instead made pregnant by a younger man who I personally believe looks a lot like a young Homer, with there being a strong theme of this character's essence living on in his son for the other characters. While I originally theorized that only one character, Homer, would be killed in Dimension 3, it would lead to a lot of characters needing to be recast to tell a new story. This allows for them to symbolically be reborn, continuing their journey in new forms, with Homer in particular being reborn within the season as a child, symbolizing how he needs to start his journey again. If this really is meant to hint at how the OA would have continued, it would explain why in OA's story from Season 1, Homer wanted so desperately to get out to be with his child, who he insists is a son, despite the fact that he was kidnapped before the child was born and only shortly after finding out that he got a woman pregnant at all. These claims of being a father could be the echoes of his memory in Dimension 4. In the show, Marling is stuck in this marriage with Andy, being his prisoner of sorts, but also being his prison guard in a way as well, trapping him in the marriage with the lie of her child being Andy's son. A Murder at the End of the World's own title seems to even allude to the seeming end of Season 4, as we will soon discuss, but while these references to the OA do seem to hint at where Season 4 would have gone, the true Season 4 of the show, if it had been renewed, would likely tackle more intense sci-fi themes based on the lore already established in the show, with the ideas that were explored in A Murder at the End of the World ultimately being their own unique story. The key reasons for the heavier sci-fi themes in Season 4, besides it just being well understood that this will be a fictional TV world, comes from hints found in both Seasons 1 and 2, particularly in the pilot of Season 1. According to the creators of the OA, they wanted a hint for every single season to be hidden in the first episode of the series, which had fans looking in the background for key details that might pan out later. One thing some fans noticed was a news article about strange UFOs flying over the state pinned to the theory board that OA's adoptive mother had up to try and solve Prairie's case. Fans immediately speculated that a future season might deal with aliens, or that the truth was that OA had actually been abducted by aliens in her story, and that we would go back in time in Season 5 to see the version of her story that involved her actually being held captive by aliens on some sort of spaceship instead of underground. However, there is much more evidence to suggest that the aliens would have been a key theme in Season 4 instead of Season 5. While there is that one hint in the pilot of Season 1, the larger evidence for the alien story comes from Season 2 as a whole, which we know Season 4 will be reflecting. Season 2's alien foreshadowing is strongest in episode 4, which is the midway point of the season, known for giving us a glimpse of the next dimension with a character's NDE. As the midpoint of the season, I think the imagery and symbolism in this episode was clearly meant to go a step further and hint at what would be coming in the season even beyond that in its mirrored dimension. This episode has the OA putting on a red dress with a flying saucer design on it, looking as if it's about to abduct someone. She puts this on to go visit Old Night, the very alien-like giant octopus who presents himself as a superior being to humans as a whole, with octopi being linked to alien life forms by conspiracy theorists. Additionally, OA listens to a tape recording of Dimension 2's Nina's dreams, which turns out to be something of a sex dream, but which starts off sounding like an alien abduction. And finally, at the end of the season, when the robots complete the 5 movements, OA begins to rise in the sky. This is not fully explained in the show, with Britt Marling in Dimension 3 writing it into her show as well, but having her tragic fall before it could be explained on why she was rising. The rising in the sky appears to be OA reaching some higher level of enlightenment in Season 2 after having integrated across both dimensions, but looks quite a bit like OA is being abducted by aliens, further hinting at aliens in Season 4. Perhaps the greatest evidence for all of this comes from the thesis film created by Zal Batman-Lige and starring Britt Marling, which was their first collaboration together as partners. A lot of fans speculated that a future season would involve going back to the earliest work of the creative duo, because previous seasons also seem to mirror and parallel previous projects of theirs as well. The plot of Season 1, for instance, was very similar to a previous film the two collaborated on called The Sound of My Voice. In this movie, Britt Marling gathered a group of people to tell her story to on the floor, the same way OA does with the Crestwood 5 in Season 1. However, instead of different dimensions, in this movie, Marling's character claimed to have traveled from the future. Season 2 likewise is very similar to Britt Marling's film Another Earth, wherein Marling's character explores how different her life would be if she had not caused a tragic and fatal car accident, by comparing her life to the version of her on Another Earth that suddenly appeared in the night sky, similar to OA observing the differences in her life with Nina Azarova in Dimension 2. The Recordist thus was believed to be inspiration for a later season as well, quite possibly one of the seasons that would be seen as the end of the story, once again referencing that T.S. Eliot quote at the end of The House on Nob Hill about going back to the beginning and understanding it for the first time. This short film, The Recordist, is available on YouTube if you haven't seen it, and I highly recommend going to watch it for yourselves before finishing this video, as there will be massive spoilers ahead. Link in the description down below. Now, the film stars Britt Marling as a young woman trying to get into a prestigious New York music program, but is struggling to write the great music piece that will help her secure the spot. She feels compelled to do this like it is her destiny, despite falling apart and experiencing turmoil trying to achieve it. While acting out, she meets an older woman who believes that Marling's character is one of many humans manipulated by aliens in the ancient past in order to make them watch over humans. Their job is to observe the humans, appearing at every major world catastrophe to witness it for themselves and for the aliens to see later. Marling's character rejects this crazy theory about her and ends up turning her attention towards the music program, which she of course gets accepted into. When she gets on the flight to New York, however, we can see from her ticket that she is actually on one of the flights doomed to hit the Twin Towers in the 9/11 terror attacks. This proves in the last moment that Marling was one of these observing aliens, called in the title of the film, The Recordists. This story indicated that, as the movie's tagline suggests, that Marling's character was born for a greater reason, but that greater reason was not her art. It was to serve as a tool for the aliens. Season 4 thus would likely focus on the similarities between the alien abduction phenomena and near-death experiences, with Kareem investigating people who go missing, such as in Season 2, but, like there, people who have had their bodies returned but with their consciousness nowhere to be found. This would all wrap around a conspiracy involving OA and Hap again, with OA being painted as increasingly connected to the aliens and the abductions themselves. But even with all of this evidence of an ancient aliens arc, why exactly is that where the show would be choosing to go for Dimension 4? The Recordist focused heavily on what we today call the ancient aliens conspiracy theory, the idea that ancient mythology that talks about gods coming down and living among the humans are actually historical accounts of aliens coming down to Earth and influencing humanity. In Judaism and Christianity, these beings are called the fallen angels, which is something OA has painted herself and others as throughout the show, with her being the original. The fallen angels of Christianity and Judaism were originally termed the sons of God in the book of Genesis. While little is explained about them in Genesis, other than that they simply existed before the Great Flood and also after, the book of Enoch, an extra-biblical text found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, tells the story of the sons of God in an expanded way, revealing that they were divine beings sent down to the earth to guide humanity towards more enlightened civilizations. These sons of God are referred to as the Watchers in the Book of Enoch, where it is explained that their ultimate duty was to watch the humans on behalf of God so they can eventually judge them during the end times. According to Enoch, the remaining descendants of the fallen angels would survive until the end times, where they would eventually be killed before the new world of peace begins. Across the 4 seasons thus far, Oe is integrating with her different selves, and by the end of season 4, she would have integrated with that final self and become a 5th grader person that contains all 4 versions of herself. The idea of merging yourself across the dimensions seems to also be inspired by Jewish Kabbalah, which speaks of Olam Tikkun, or the repairing of the worlds, by merging the physical with the spiritual. This process involves the destruction of the descendants of the fallen angels, similar to what is described in the Book of Enoch. This is said to release the lights of God that are trapped within physical shells, returning the light to God himself. This will, in turn, bring about the Messianic Age, a renewal of the world after a great destruction. This appears to be the inspiration for Oe's integration across the dimensions, experiencing her little deaths with every body she leaves behind, eventually becoming a more complete being as a result. According to Jewish tradition, humanity as we understand it is only meant to exist for 6,000 years, at the end of which we will face what is called the end times, but then have a new era of peace. According to the Jewish calendar, which itself is an estimation counting back to the beginning of time based on the Bible, we are within a few centuries of the year 6000, which is not the exact year that anything in particular will take place, but the marker by which we can expect a lot to have already happened in terms of apocalyptic prophecy, but also plenty more to come as we transition into that Messianic age. Dimension 4 could take place in our modern time, or it could flash forward within a few centuries to show what has become of humanity before this big apocalypse, which, after an entire season of alien abduction, seems that it will ultimately happen after Oe experiences some sort of final death, symbolizing the completeness of her 4 selves. According to the ancient aliens conspiracy theory, angels were just aliens who had come down to Earth in order to guide humans and help them grow, and ultimately to judge humans like the Watchers were meant to at the end times. This judgment would be for who deserves to be saved and who deserves to be left behind and not join the Messianic kingdom. In Dimension 4 then, these aliens seem to be watching over the humans using Recordists like the Oe to see who deserves to be saved and who deserves to be left behind in the destruction of the apocalypse. My personal theory is that all season long, Hap as his Dimension 4 self would feel that something is not right about his life, no matter how perfect it may seem. He will likely have a lot of people coming after him because of his success in this world, and with Oe playing a role to be his prison guard this season, he would feel like she is part of the conspiracy against him. Season 4 would end similarly to Season 2, being its mirror dimension, with Hap firing a bullet, but this time Oe experiencing something of a death instead of Homer. After this final death, Oe will start to rise into the sky just as she did at the end of Season 2, but this time we would see that she is being carried away by an alien ship, ultimately saving her at the last moment. If the Oe is perhaps the last of the Watchers on Earth, then her final death would be the last of the aliens' involvement on Earth, as they would have to judge who is worthy of being saved based off of the information they already have from the Oe and others like her. This would trigger an event where everyone who is to be saved would be abducted by aliens in a rapture-like event, with those unworthy left behind. According to at least one fan, Zalbat Manglish has claimed that the end of the Oe involves the characters getting on a spaceship and going to Saturn. And as far-fetched as it sounds that he would reveal this, it does make a lot of sense. Saturn has been an important part of the show since Season 1, when Hap revealed that the audio of Oe's near-death experiences matched the sounds of the distant rings of Saturn. These were the near-death experiences where Oe traveled to a strange cosmic place where Katoon was waiting for her. Season 4 is the technical end of the story, and I believe it's possible Zal put out this very wild claim thinking most fans would believe the end of the story to be Season 5, and not realizing that he was only giving away one very small connecting detail between Season 4 and 5. Season 4 ends with Oe and perhaps many others being taken up by these alien ships and returned to Saturn as some sort of safe cosmic realm while the Earth experiences its destruction. In Judaism, Saturn is the highest of all heavens, representing a state of completeness, hence why the Sabbath is on Saturday or Saturn Day. As Season 4 takes these spiritual ideas and turns them into alien-based sci-fi, it would seem that Saturn is not a heaven in the spiritual sense in Dimension 4, but a haven for the alien beings that have been watching over our Earth. In ancient alien conspiracy theory, the Earth is seen as something of a farming and prison planet, creating a place where species like humans can grow and develop on their own, with the aliens watching over them to see if they are worthy enough to join them, and being able to leave those who are not worthy behind. Khatun alludes to not wanting Hap to get his hands on the movements because he could ultimately break out of his dimension and cause damage as well. Not just to other dimensions as we would see in the show, but even to higher beings like Khatun if Hap can make it to the dimension within Saturn. Saturn is presented then as a sort of hiding spot / portal to the physical world. The divine beings are safe from dangerous humans within. The possibility of OA as a watcher seems to have evidence all the way back in the very first episode, where even as a child, OA seems to be someone who is sent just to observe her father, as well as witness the tragic accident that would take away his and other people's children on that school bus. OA as a watcher is given free will, but in doing what she wants, she is still destined to maintain her duty of watching over humans so Khatun can observe them safely from within Saturn. The Watchers in the past had free will, and with that, they seem to choose to rebel against God and take human wives, choosing to live among them the same way OA chooses to stay among the humans every time she has an NDE where she is allowed to pass on. She kept choosing to return, and thus would be put in situations where she could observe more humans and their behaviors for Khatun. I believe many, if not most of the characters in the show will end up being saved, and I think there is even evidence that Hap himself could end up being saved and actually make it to this hidden dimension that he wasn't originally meant to get to. But even if Hap himself ends up being saved, I think it's possible that at least one person, particularly Steve, may actually get left behind. Each season starts and ends the same way, starting with a medical examination of sorts in a bed and ending with a character chasing a vehicle. This starts with OA chasing Hap's car at the end of her story in Season 1, with Hap leaving, representing Homer being taken away from her. This was mirrored at the end of the episode with Steve chasing OA's ambulance, it symbolizing her being taken away from him as she dies and travels to another dimension, leaving him behind as he shouts, "Take me with you." Season 2 continues this pattern of Steve being the one who chases the vehicle each season, but in Season 4, that would have a more sci-fi twist. Instead of a car like OA chases, or an ambulance like Steve has chased in the past, Season 4 would end with OA and the others seemingly being taken up by spaceships and off to Saturn. I believe, like Hap in Season 2, Steve will watch as OA is pulled into the air by the strange UFO in a dramatic ending to the season. As everyone is being taken away, Steve would begin to chase after the ship, screaming, "Take me with you," just like he did in Season 1 as OA's ambulance became too fast for him. Now, the entire show thus far has been about OA trying to save her friends, the Haptives, with a complex chain of events that only work because Steve takes the time to invest in OA in Season 1. Even then, Steve is shown as having a great fear that OA will leave him behind once she gets her friends, and Steve even lashes out at OA at the end of Season 1 because of this, stabbing her in the leg. This would likely be mirrored in Season 4, with Steve perhaps being the one who actually delivers the final killing blow instead of Hap, seeing OA as trying to escape him instead of just trying to help him. Steve may have been trying to help the OA all season long, just like he would in Season 3, but in order to maintain her role as Hap's wife and prison guard, OA likely would have to become hostile to Steve, perhaps even having to play the villain in his story involving him. He may feel especially betrayed if he spent the season thinking that she simply had amnesia again, the way she did in Season 3, only to realize that she has remembered everything the entire time. While she would ultimately have to play the part she did in Season 4 to keep Hap in his place, Steve would feel betrayed, and after perhaps being manipulated by Hap, could end up lashing out against the OA. This final lashing out could make him unworthy in the eyes of the aliens or Khatun, leaving him behind to die on Earth while everyone else is saved. OA thus would want to go back and save Steve, her biggest help and support in Season 1, and perhaps across the entire show really, the person who made all of this possible, who only ended up getting left behind. And since Khatun always let OA act out her free will, she will allow this, but the only way to go back this time would be to start the entire loop over. Going back this time would mean restarting the loop, to return to an earlier point in time to try and save Steve in particular by doing things a little different, even if it's understood that different parts of your memories would still be lost in the different dimensions as you repeat the story. The reason OA believes that she can make things different this time is not because of her own actions if she retains her memory, but because of Steve's even if he doesn't. At the end of Season 1, Steve chased the ambulance containing the OA, but was not fast enough to get to it, symbolizing how he had more growing to do before he could be worthy of a spiritual travel with the OA. The show is one big loop of 5 seasons, but each season is also its own smaller loop. And by the end of Season 2, or the second loop, Steve has grown enough spiritually that he has jumped straight to Dimension 3, and is fast enough to catch up to OA on her ambulance. This gives OA faith that even if she and the others play out their roles exactly the same way they did before, completely forgetting their entire mission is for Steve, that Steve will still have grown enough by the end of this second giant loop that he'll actually make it to the spaceship at the end of Season 4. This makes the show an endless loop that the viewer gets trapped in with the OA, hoping, seemingly in vain, that Steve will one day make the right decision and break the cycle himself, with OA and the others only really being able to give him the chance to try. OA would likely not go alone, but the other Haftas will probably want to go with her, and I believe, among others, BB-8 will choose to go as well. BB-8 is implied to be an angel in Season 1, with her being the Crestwood 5's parallel to OA herself. In one scene, she has a halo over her head coming from a car light, and in the Crestwood cafeteria, she is frequently seen with angel's wings behind her as they perform the movements. Based on OA's story, she would have her consciousness sent back to the time she was held captive by Hap in his basement, to the near-death experience where she ate the white dove given to her by Katoon. The white dove seems to carry the consciousness of Dimension 4's fully integrated OA, as it is after this that OA in Season 1 begins to call herself the OA in her story, before later realizing that the name she was trying to remember is actually the OA. BB-8, however, never seemed to have a near-death experience, but that doesn't mean she can't be an angel. An angel in the show is described as being an interdimensional traveler, and while we see the most frequent way to recognize these travelers is by their near-death experiences, it would seem that you can also just travel back to the very beginning of your life, to your birth, where you undoubtedly would lose your memories. BB-8 thus likely travels back in time with OA at the end of Season 4, but lives her entire life and thus doesn't remember any of their journey from before, with OA still seeming to have some fragments of it at the very least, even if she doesn't have all of her memories. The reason I believe BB-8 will make the choice to return is because of the conversation OA has with her in Season 1. OA tries to explain to her the concept of the same play, different characters, emphasizing that BB-8 and Steve have been caught in this loop for a while, that this isn't the real beginning of their story. OA claims that BB-8 has forgotten her first reason, which is literally Steve, something OA emphasizes by saying Steve is the one who clearly needs help, not the kid who can already sing like an angel. This is heavily foreshadowed by BB-8's relationship with her own brother, who died shortly before the season started. BB-8 and her brother Theo were rather close growing up, it seems, but Theo got addicted to drugs and BB-8 had to be the one to send him to rehab. When BB-8 has the boys help her clean out Theo's stuff, Steve pulls out his snowsuit and BB-8 begins to cry because Steve reminds her so much of Theo. In Season 2, BB-8 has dreams of who she believes to be Theo asking her for help, thinking that she's being haunted by her brother and that she could have done more to help him, only to realize in the end that it was Steve asking for help in her dreams, with his shaved head making him more closely resemble BB-8's brother. BB-8 at the end of Season 4 would realize that her brother Theo is an important part of her story, giving her the training she needs early in life and the conditioning to simply love the face of Steve because of how much it looks like her brother. When BB-8 would have presumably traveled to Dimensions 2 and perhaps later 4, she likely would have met versions of her brother who never died, who lived a very different life from him in Dimension 1, and perhaps who wouldn't have had such a strained relationship with BB-8. It is through BB-8's interactions with him in higher dimensions that we never got that would have really cemented the importance of Theo as someone who helped BB-8 become who she was meant to be before having to leave so she could focus on her mission, which was ultimately for Steve. Now we know the end of all our exploring, as per the house on Nob Hill, is to go back to the beginning and understand the place for the first time, something paralleled by the in-world use of Russian nesting dolls, which creator Britt Marling said was an important inspiration to the show. The point had always been to use the seasons to open up the OA as a character, like a Russian nesting doll, until we reach the very center, then to start putting those dolls back inside of each other until we make it back to the beginning, with the original shell being restored around her. This would mean returning to the starting point in Dimension 1 when OA was trapped in Hap's basement so that we can finally understand the truth. OA had hinted that she might not have been entirely honest throughout her story, seeming to craft a narrative that is just believable enough to be real while still leaving hints that something is not right about what she is saying. The point of the OA was to take us back in a complete loop, to give us a first instinct the way Kareem did at the beginning of the house at Nob Hill that would have revealed its true ending, but then taking us on a long and complicated journey back to where we started to appreciate why that first instinct was so important. The first instinct of the Crestwood Five and of the audience as a whole was that OA was lying about her story, that something in her story, at least some small detail, was just not true. And it would only make sense to go back to the beginning and show us the true version of OA's story if something had been dramatically different. With each season starting the same way, the most logical starting point for Season 5 would not be at the beginning of the story that the OA told the Crestwood Five, but at the point where the consciousness of Dimension 4 OA re-entered Dimension 1 Prairie's body. This seems to be the moment that Dimension 1 Prairie asks Katoon to go back to her life on Earth so that she can help the other Haptives. To this point, Prairie had been blind and could not see. After eating the dove, she returns to the basement with her eyesight returned, now calling herself the OA, which she later learned was her trying to remember the name OA. After getting the dove from Katoon, OA returns to her body where she is examined in a bed by Hap, similar to how she would be examined by medical professionals in Seasons 1 and 2, and presumably 3 and also 4. However, this is just OA's story, and while it would start off almost exactly the same as we saw in Season 1, as OA descends deeper into the basement with Hap returning her, things would start to be a bit different. And when OA is returned to her room, I believe that she will open her eyes, expecting to see Homer and the other Haptives in a dramatic moment where she is reunited with them again. But when she does, she will instead see that the Haptives are not there at all, that they never were there, and that OA and Hap were alone at his home the entire time. My theory is that OA did run away as she explained, and she did meet Hap. However, the story she gave us was from a very specific perspective, which was both blind and seemingly delusional. OA doesn't start her story with her meeting Hap, but takes the time to talk about how, as a child, she was diagnosed with delusional thoughts. She seemed to think that her father was sending her messages in her dreams, and that the Russian mafia was after her. While in a trance-like sleepwalking state, a young Prairie is convinced to do dangerous things, such as her adoptive parents recorded her doing with a knife. OA admits that her dreams were so vivid that even as a blind person, she felt that she could see in them. For this, she is put on medication until she is 21, claiming it dulled her, but that it didn't actually stop the dreams or the delusions that came with it. When she runs away to meet her father because of these delusions, she ends up meeting Hap, who does appear to be a real person. OA doesn't just hear Hap, she touches him, feels him, but at this time, Hap appears to be a good and well-meaning person. Just before asking Hap to take her into his home to study her, Hap encourages OA to stop taking her medication, which she admitted to dulling her senses even if her delusions were still going on in her head. On her way to Hap's home, OA would have come down from years of medication use, bringing back her symptoms in full form while also making her experience withdrawal, making everything worse. It is not until she is alone in the basement that she suddenly hears the Haptives, and only after she has hit her head against the wall. Immediately, Scott tries to blame OA for where she's ended up, but Homer cuts in, saying not to let her thoughts bring her down, as if Scott is just one of OA's thoughts. The other Haptives appear to essentially be voices in OA's head, similar to the one she would talk to as a child while in her trance-like sleepwalking state, where she was literally acting out and physically experiencing her conversations with voices that only she could hear. With her not being able to reach out and feel the people she is talking to, they would have to make up some stories explaining why she can hear them but not touch them. They, as aspects of Prairie, would only be able to work with the information that OA has, which includes very vague descriptions of patients that Hap supposedly saw, which he told her about while they were at the restaurant together. This explains why later, OA was able to find a video of the real-life Homer. She knew it was a real patient based off the stories Hap had told her, but she knew that going to the police about the situation would be of no use, because the real Homer would be seen as just fine. Instead, OA uses the video of Homer as further inspiration for the character in her head as she remembers him. This means that OA would not just create the Haptives, but also the evil versions of Hap, imagining him as a villain who was holding them hostage, and then needing to imagine elaborate ways for them to escape. The real Hap seems aware that OA is having delusions, and in some scenes looks more like he is playing along with them instead of actually being evil. A great example of this is the scene where OA first makes sandwiches, which Hap enjoys eating. He doesn't seem like he's surprised or like he's forcing OA to eat dry, nutritious food nuggets like a prisoner. He even lets her make sandwiches for the others, trying to make her feel welcome in his home. When he yells at the Haptives about how he won't be making this a regular thing, it sounds more like he's warning Prairie that making all this extra food for people who aren't really there isn't going to be a regular thing. And these food pellets seem to be part of Oe's bigger delusions to rationalize what her friends eat in captivity. When Oe first drinks from the stream, the water is disgusting and no one even bothers to warn her. This is written off as the Haptives using it for bathing at that point, but it almost seems as if Oe was never intended to drink from there, and then when she does, the voices in her head try to make up reasons for why it doesn't taste good in that moment. Even when Hap begs Oe to get his EpiPen, he brings up the other Haptives at the last minute in a very forced way, as if he's trying to rationalize with Oe on her level instead of trying to use real-world logic in order to save his life. This would make Hap the purest version of himself, the opposite of how he was presented in the Oe story in Season 1. A seemingly nice man who probably fell for a woman he thought was truly special and invited her into his home only for her delusions to get in the way of any possible romantic bond. He would all season insist that she isn't just a patient, that he sees her as a partner, just like we see their conversations in Oe's story, because he likely really did see her this way, with the idea of her being a prisoner being something she insisted upon. Oe likewise becomes the darkest version of herself, the version of her that ruins Hap's life, and like she nearly did with her delusions as a child, commits an act of violence against Hap, pushing him down the stairs. This leads to her near-death experience where she is revived by Hap, and where she comes back with her sight. After returning to the basement and seeing that her friends are not real, Oe would have a massive breakdown, and in part, she would blame Hap. If she retains any of her memory, she would remember that Hap is responsible for killing at least one of the Haptives in Dimension 3 possibly, meaning that in a 5th season of the show, that character could not return to their role, such as Homer. Going back in time to when the Haptives supposedly were living then would lead to those characters having to be written out of the story in another way within the show. Oe would blame Hap for having killed her friends in Dimension 3, or even just Homer, something this Hap would only see as yet another delusion of Prairie's trying to paint him as some sort of evil man. Season 5 would return to the more grounded roots of the show and present the season as a sort of domestic drama, showing Hap trying to connect with Oe, but still being too flawed to help work through her ideas and visions of him. While not evil in the way Oe painted him as in her story, Hap would still be a very flawed man who seems to dedicate himself so much to science that he has little time for anything else, even forcing himself to sleep just so he can get back to work, as he explains to Oe. He was presented as an awkward man who struggles to actually connect with someone like the Oe despite clearly wanting to and putting his best foot forward. Being just different aspects of the Oe also explains why each of the Haptives corresponds to each of the dimensions, to a different version of Oe herself from those dimensions. This is why Rachel's name can be found in the braille in the background of the FBI office in Season 1, and why Rachel claims to simply float above her body after an NDE in Dimension 1. Homer's name can be seen in a braille pattern in the window of the house on Nob Hill in Dimension 2, with Homer's NDE having him traveling to Dimension 2 in Season 1. Scott we later learned to travel to Dimension 3, where we would find his name somewhere in Season 3, I imagine, and Renata presumably in Dimension 4. The idea that Oe had some sort of mental illness that made her delusional and thus created the Haptives is seen as offensive by some theorists, but that is just modern political programming in my opinion. What Britt Marling and Zalbat Monglish set out to do with this story is the same as Madame Blavatsky with her two-part series The Secret Doctrine, to examine every world myth and their differences and line them up in a narrative that people of the modern era can understand, reconciling spiritual belief with our understanding of science today, including what we understand about mental illness. The point of the Oe has always been not that the Oe is sick or that she has mental illness, but that she is a complex spiritual being, not necessarily meant to fit into the limitations of a human body, with her having powers beyond that of a normal human, and yet only being able to fit a shattered aspect of herself into a body at one time. In Blavatsky's work, she talks about how the loop is best represented by the 7 days of the week, starting with Sunday, represented by the sun, and ending with Saturday, represented by Saturn. The sun is the beginning of all things. It is the light of a new beginning, the light of the beginning of the day, the energy that comes from youth. Saturn is the farthest planet and often called the dark sun because of its dim lighting and its slow motion compared to the other visible planets. Saturn is at the end of the visible loop of the planetary lights, the dying of a sun in the distance that was thought to perhaps be once as vibrant as our sun is today. But just as Saturday loops back into Sunday, and night loops back into day, and death loops back into birth, so does Saturn loop back into the sun, making them opposite ends of the planetary spectrum, but also right next to each other as the loop starts over again. Dimension 1 of the OA was referred to by Britt Marling as the first layer of the maze, which as a layer to a maze indicates that it loops entirely around the show, Dimension 1 being both Season 1 and Season 5's location, opposite ends of the spectrum of good and evil, yet existing right on top of each other. Just as the extremes of Saturn and the Sun exist next to each other in the cyclical loop while also being on opposite ends, so do the most evil and pure forms of OA and Hap in Dimension 1. The noble versions of herself in her head next to the evil version of Hap, and the broken version of her in the physical world with the well-meaning man that Hap is next to her, with the reality of which one is real and which is the lie being blurred depending on your understanding of the OA's mind and soul. More evidence for this theory that the other haptives are just aspects of the OA comes from its Masonic symbolism used in the show. Freemasonry is just one of the many institutions that the esoteric movement passed through over thousands of years. And while the show does allude to Freemasonry with its symbolism, it mostly uses publicly accessible surface-level information about Freemasonry to reinforce general esoteric ideas within the show, as opposed to trying to reveal things from within Freemasonry itself. The most obvious example of Masonic symbolism is in the title of the show, which can be written using the two tools used in the Masonic logo, which features a compass and a square. The compass is a Masonic tool used to draw perfect circles, such as the O in the OA, and the A is drawn using the square, a perfect 90-degree angle whose edges can be used to make the perfect mirrored lines with a breaking point right at the center. While the main 3 degrees of Masonry are only available for men, there is an appendant body known as the Order of the Eastern Star that is primarily for women. This group has a series of 5 degrees or ceremonies instead of 3 like in men's Masonry. This group doesn't use the traditional altar that men use in their Masonic lodges, and instead they use a 5-sided pentagon altar, shaped very similar to the prison that the OA is trapped in within her story. This altar has 5 sides, each reflecting a symbol from one of its 5 degrees, but ultimately being one part of a bigger whole, the same way that the other haptives are each one part of OA's whole. While little is known about the exact nature of these degrees outside of the people who are actually initiated into the Order of the Eastern Star, it is public information that each degree or ceremony from the Order of the Eastern Star represents one of the 5 potential stages of a woman's life. The first of these is the role of the daughter, reflecting how in Season 1, the OA was focused on her role as a daughter trying to find her father. The second role is that of a widow, paralleling Season 2 of the show, following OA giving up on her father, accepting his death even in other dimensions. The third is the role of a wife, the role OA would have in Dimension 3 as Britt Marling, the wife of Hap's Jason Isaacs. The fourth is that of a sister, which I believe to hint at OA's role as a sort of authority to Hap in Dimension 4, recognizing the two of them as children of the mind of Britt Marling, and OA having a duty to imprison Hap from that point on to make sure he can't wreak havoc on the world. The fifth and final role is that of a mother, which of course, if you kept moving around the 5-sided altar, would loop back to the role of a daughter. This is because the role of a mother is to have a daughter, and thus you can return to the first role you had, but as the creator of that role, understanding its significance in a way you couldn't as the daughter yourself. This hints at OA in the show becoming the mother in Season 5, returning to Dimension 1 and seeing herself as the mother of the haptives, their ultimate creator. The concept as a whole also seems heavily linked to Gnostic themes that also helped inspire the show. Gnosticism was a spiritual movement in the early centuries of Christianity that told new stories about characters like Jesus with the intent of enlightening the audience with new metaphors. These stories often focused on the character of Sophia, a divine being whose name means wisdom. While Christianity likes to present there as being only one God and then his only son, Gnosticism emphasized the importance of the first God and his son while also claiming there to be endless numbers of divine emanations in higher dimensions. In the stories of Sophia, she is often the lowest of these divine emanations, the last to be created in those higher dimensions. In these various stories, Sophia is portrayed as wanting to create the way that the great first creator god did, which was alone. But instead of waiting for her divine twin to create with, known in Gnosticism as a syzygy, one story called the Apocryphon of John has Sophia trying to create on her own. Without a divine divine partner, this causes Sophia to create an aborted mess of physical matter, with the only sentient part of her creation being called the Demiurge. Sophia is a shadow of the great god, wanting to be like him, but in her imperfections, she created something imperfect as well. The Demiurge is then the shadow of Sophia and also wishes to create. As a shadow of a shadow, the Demiurge is lost in the physical world, thinking he's the god of it and not realizing that there are higher beings who exist in the world above him. All he can see of these beings is the remnants of Sophia's light that make up the physical world, which he uses to animate the bodies of humans, trapping parts of Sophia in his world to worship him as a god, not realizing that she herself is a greater god who created him. This plays out in the show with Oe being Sophia, whose light has been trapped underground by Hap, who clearly represents the Demiurge. Since the Demiurge is just a creation of Sophia's, however, that would make Hap, the evil Hap, or at least the evil version of Hap, just the creation of Oe, a delusion of hers. With the real Hap not holding her prisoner, it represents how Sophia was ultimately held prisoner by her own self, that she was sucked into her own creation. With Oe at the restaurant even inviting Hap to take her in to study her, paralleling how Sophia wanted to create the world that the Demiurge would end up pulling her into. Now in Gnostic texts, Sophia can have different divine emanations which are claimed to be her syzygy or divine twin, that syzygy also being a lower cosmic idea like Sophia representing a different virtue. However, as a whole, the texts present Jesus as the ultimate syzygy to Sophia, with him being the one necessary to come not and undo her creation, but to make it whole, as if he is her male counterpart and this was a creation they were meant to have together. After creating his female counterpart, the first god and that wife work together to create Jesus, the first son of the god, who himself represents the first of the divine emanations made through a coupling, with Sophia being the very last. Jesus traveling down to the lowest of worlds to rescue Sophia plays out in the show with the character Kareem, who is this world's symbol for the Christ figure. Kareem is introduced in the first episode of Season 2, but does not meet Oe in person until episode 4, which is titled Syzygy. This is also the name of the club where Oe performs with Old Knight. To further prove that these characters are meant to be divine twins in the show, episode 5 has them wandering through the house on Nob Hill, the secret entrance to which is designed to look like the female reproductive system. With Kareem and Oe traveling through a tunnel the size of a coffin with a rush of water, it gives the impression that they are twins being reborn into the initiation system of the house, with them being separated later, indicating that they were twins or syzygies separated at birth. Jesus is presented in most Gnostic texts as being sent down to Earth to explain the metaphors of Sophia to humanity, who themselves are her shattered pieces, with Jesus being the only one who can understand the truth after dying on the cross and having the great spiritual awakening there. Kareem likewise is the only one, according to the psychic dream study, that could make it to the end of the house on Nob Hill and see the truth and understand it without being pulled into it entirely. He would have spent the rest of the seasons helping Oe as Sophia collect her shattered pieces from across the dimensions through her integration with her alternate selves, a mission Old Knight claims a brother is sent in every dimension to help the Oe with. The haptives thus are the shattered aspects of Sophia within humanity who she needs to integrate with to become whole, with Kareem sent to help restore her to her proper state. As divine emanations and cosmic twins, Jesus and Sophia, like many of the cosmic couplings of the gods, ultimately represent different aspects of the same figure. Sophia translates as wisdom, and Jesus, as well as the tradition of firstborn sons to gods as a whole, representing wisdom as well. Sophia as a wisdom character is ironically named, as it is because of a lack of wisdom that she ultimately learns that she should not have done this, only becoming wise when Jesus has restored her to her original place. Jesus represents true wisdom, the part of Sophia that knew not to do this, but is wise enough to know how to fix the mistakes now. This parallel seems to be proven in the Gnostic Gospel of Judas, which is one of the few Gnostic Gospels that doesn't feature Sophia. In this text, Judas is presented as someone who didn't simply betray Jesus for wealth, but because it was part of a greater cosmic plan in order for Jesus to complete his mission. Judas is said to align with the powers of Saklos, the Demiurge, and a force of darkness, but in betraying Jesus, he still ultimately helps Jesus by removing the flesh that clothes him. This is seen as a necessary evil for the Christ figure to return to his higher state and to create the final earthly kingdom. This is a reference to the book of Revelations within the Bible, which shows the apocalypse as not being able to happen until the slaughtered lamb opens the seals of the apocalypse, the slaughtered lamb being a symbol for Jesus on the cross. In the stories of Sophia, Jesus acknowledges that the Sophia narratives are just metaphors for what he experienced during his death or in other instances of a higher state. Thus, Sophia is not some additional divine figure that we should be worshipping, and this is something more or less proven in mythologies of other cultures where these two figures are represented by a singular entity. A great example of this are the mysteries of Odin, who is presented as a god of wisdom and someone who hangs himself from the world tree for 9 days in order to experience the different lives of the 9 different dimensions, eventually becoming whole again and becoming more wise from the experience. All of this indicates that ultimately the Sophia figure is just the fallen aspect of the greater Christ figure, both experiencing the 3 deaths of the 3 higher dimensions in the OA, representing the 3 dimensions Jesus travels through in the Gnostic tales, and the 3 higher dimensions of Jewish Kabbalah. Ultimately, however, the humans that Jesus and Sophia want to save and restore to a higher state are children of Sophia, with them having her light, and the demiurge who has constructed them in many ways being their father. In the OA, Hap seems to have become a sort of father to the Haptives, particularly to Homer, who OA has fallen in love with the idea that the Haptives are essentially just voices in OA's head, some fans have speculated that Homer himself is just Hap using a different voice to interact with OA when she is deep in her delusions, meaning that the man OA is falling in love with is just her perception of the man Hap can be. Hap would have started playing along with OA's delusions when they were a bit more simple and innocent, to try and make the home he said that she should have when they first met, regardless of her mental state. But this would lead to him eventually creating the imagined version of Homer who OA falls in love with. Some fans believe the actors are even aware of this plot twist, with Jason Isaacs and Emery Cohen putting together a video of them performing the movements together, with Homer just behind Jason Isaacs. This would also explain why Hap seems to have such a grip over Homer in other dimensions, being the boss and mentor to Homer in Dimension 2, instead of Homer simply being another one of the patients at his hospital. If the clues from A Murder at the End of the World have also been properly applied, this would also explain why that show's version of Homer dies, with his son being left to be raised by that world's version of Hap. It would also give an explanation to Elodie claiming that to lose Hap would be to lose Homer, not because Hap is the reason that OA met Homer in one dimension or another, but because the version of Homer that OA is in love with only exists because of Hap. Key to this season, I think, will be the character of Elodie, who's presented as Hap's syzygy in Season 2, as discussed earlier. Now, Elodie says she only helped Hap in order to help the OA, but she has shown a lot more affection to Hap in particular, seeming to enjoy her relations with him beyond it being supposedly necessary just to advance the story. While in Dimension 2, Elodie claims to be an experienced traveler, and claims to have previously been to a world where she was an actress and saw all the different versions of her life played out on screen, alluding to her previously coming from Dimension 3. This made fans believe that Elodie is unique and that she's traveling backwards in the loop that the OA is on, getting caught up in the same journey, but doing so in order to help Hap more than anyone else. This implies that OA's Dimension 2 is Elodie's Dimension 4, and likewise that she exists somewhere in Dimension 1 as a real person. My theory thus far is that Renata is a parallel in OA's story for Elodie, who I believe to be a 5th patient that Hap began to see, and to develop an actual connection with. The subplot of Homer sleeping with Renata always stood out as kind of particular to me, and if Homer is an aspect of Hap, then Homer cheating on OA could indicate Hap breaking down and I think sleeping with Elodie after many sessions of him testing her after her near-death experience together. Elodie I imagine as someone who fell in love with Hap for his mind, appreciating him authentically in Dimension 1's Season 5 storyline. Elodie thus could understand Hap to be a wonderful and well-meaning man, and OA to be a person who is very hard to deal with. As Elodie progresses backwards through the dimensions, she would see the evil version of Hap, but know that he is ultimately a good person in Dimension 1, making it easy to help him on his journey to become that man again, with Hap's best self seemingly being the reformed version of Hap in OA's head, created by her and traveling to Dimensions 2, 3, and 4, integrating with his better selves along the way and learning from OA before being able to come back to Dimension 1 as the good version of Hap. Elodie would likely spend all of Season 5 flirting with Hap and trying to develop a relationship with him, but he would be dedicated to Oe, who is living with him, even though he is not in a real relationship with her. And this is something I think Elodie would ultimately love and respect about Hap, seeing it as part of what makes him such a good man, and what makes Oe such a terrible person in her mind, since she can't see the good man Hap is. Now, the big question most people have after hearing this theory is, if the Haptives aren't real, why do we see them in higher dimensions such as 2, 3, and 4? As discussed earlier, the real Hap did seem to have 3 patients, with Oe finding a video of Homer in real life as well. The Haptives are all based off of real people, at least as far as Hap's description of them goes when he first met Oe at the restaurant, and we've already seen in Season 2's finale that imaginary characters such as the Oe and Hap can jump into the bodies of people who inspire them in Dimension 3, the actors of the people who played them. From Dimension 3, the other realities appear to be lower in imaginary dimensions, but in Dimension 1, Oe would feel like her reality is the most real, with Dimensions 2, 3, and 4 being higher imaginary worlds that she created. Dimensions 1 and 3 would be 2 opposite ends of the loop she is trapped in, with each seeming just as real as the other, and both presenting the other as fantasies of the main character. Like in Season 3, Oe will have a moment at the end of Season 5 where she realizes that she too has the power to make fantasy become reality. Like with Britt Marling in Dimension 3, writing the scene on the airplane in Season 2 that would later come to life in Season 3, Oe will have a waking up moment where one of her delusions she remembers suddenly becomes a reality. Since the start of Season 5, Oe will have felt like she was wrong about everything she said in her story, the Haptives being non-existent and Hap appearing to be a good man. All season long, everything she remembers as happening from her story would play out entirely differently, and she would begin to think that she was just wrong about it all. At the end of the season, however, we know that Oe will make it back to the bridge she jumped off of at the beginning of Season 1. This would be the first moment that happens the way that the Oe remembers it from her supposed story. In the original pilot script for the Oe, it even says that the Oe seems to be looking at us through the cell phone camera that is recording her, as if she knows that other people are watching this in a TV show. This is the moment Britt Marling referred to in one interview as us seeing a glimpse of the center of the maze in the very beginning of the pilot. Oe then realizes that she can make her friends real by telling her story to the Crestwood Five, being just vague and misleading enough for them to not realize just how honest she is being about what she experienced, giving a lot of the story to them from the perspective of a blind person without filling in all the details so they could imagine those characters as real. This moment where the Oe jumps also seems to be the moment where Oe shatters herself, as foreshadowed by Elodie. According to her conversation with Oe in Dimension 2, to try and jump to a reality where she doesn't know Hap would lead to a place where she doesn't know Homer either. Season 1 is interestingly the only season that doesn't seem to contain Hap or Homer, both just being in Oe's story. This heavily implies to me that Oe's jump on the bridge shatters her, and thus Oe has to jump to higher dimensions to become whole again, integrating with the evil Hap who is part of her but also getting back Homer along the way. Oe's jump would have shattered her, sending Hap and the captives into the higher dimensions and leaving Oe alone without her delusions for Season 1 in Crestwood. Like with how she and Hap could jump into the bodies of the actors who played them in Dimension 3, the fantasy version of the Haptives would be able to jump into the bodies of people who inspired them in Dimension 2, tricking us into thinking they were real in Dimension 1 as well. And of course, we can see from Season 1 alone that the show was always about the power of belief and how to trick yourself into realizing certain powers that you have, something best explained by the 5 movements. In Season 1, the characters doubt if the movements will work, and they don't work the same way in future seasons as they do in Season 1. Outside of Oe's story, the only time the movements were performed in Season 1 was at the cafeteria, with them thinking the movements worked because Oe made it to Dimension 2. However, in Season 2, when the Crestwood Five perform the movements for Oe in Dimension 2, she ends up having a nearly magical reaction just as the movements finish. Steve himself likewise falls over right as the movements end, indicating an instant travel. That is not what happened to the Oe in Season 1, however. Even after being shot by a bullet, Oe is still alive after the movements finish, and in fact is still alive at the time an ambulance gets there and while it drives away. According to the sheriff's wife in Oe's story, swimming to the other side was always a matter of will, and Oe and the Haptives have always had that will. They never needed the movements to travel to other dimensions when they died, they were already traveling to different dimensions every time Hap killed them. When Oe was shot by the bullet, all she needed in order to make it to Dimension 2 was the will, something she said she had as the ambulance took her away and she began to think about Homer. It would seem that the movements did not actually work at all in Season 1, but that Oe already could travel to another dimension when she died, this time choosing to travel to Homer. However, because Oe did make it to the other side and was able to send back Rachel's ghost, the Crestwood Five were able to believe that the movements really did work that time, and with the power of belief, they really did work the second time. Oe had already insisted the power of belief and true conviction was necessary for the movements to work, but the destiny-driven accidental timing allows for the Crestwood Five to believe in them for real to use the movements in Season 2. The entire show then is more than just an attempt to reconcile human myth and history, but an attempt to push the limits of what those mean about the nature of humans and what we are capable of with our harnessed power of belief. Before we go, however, I would like to discuss one final secret of the OA, one that would be revealed more so in Season 4 of the show, but that makes sense to explain here at the very end. One of the most mysterious aspects of the show is the title, which we have already broken down to have symbolism ranging from Freemasonry through esoterica, particularly with Madame Blavatsky. Blavatsky's two-part series, The Secret Doctrine, is understood to be an attempt to mirror the initiations of the mystery schools of the past, with a much heavier focus on Western mysticism. Through her elaborate but fake secret doctrine, she weaves a narrative that is meant to explain things through metaphor, with her embedding some of her own secret society secrets into the book to be decoded. The O and the A in the title of the OA, when put together, make up the basis for a lot of symbols found all over the ancient world, often a reference to a god or a mountain of the gods, with the A being the mountain and the O being the great ring at the top, representing God. When correctly reading the Secret Doctrine, some people have speculated that her secret codes are meant to indicate that deep in humanity's past, the planet Saturn was what we would call our polar sun. This is considered a sort of cosmic conspiracy theory that all the ancient myths of the world told stories about only the stars and planets and their motions in the sky, with most of our modern stories focusing on the journey of the sun across the 12 zodiac signs over the course of the year, as that is the most easily recognizable pattern of planets and stars to the human eye in our current era. However, this theory puts forth that ancient mythology actually explains that Saturn was once a being so close to the Earth that we were in orbit directly under it, with it appearing to float directly above the Earth at our polar north. This, in modern times, has become a sort of internet phenomena with multiple websites detailing the supposed histories of different planets in our night sky based off of what myths say about them, but the most common of these is the idea that Saturn in particular was so close to us that it was considered more important to humans than the actual sun, whose light would bounce off of Saturn, making it look like the greatest source of light in our sky that we were constantly rotating with, the sun just looking more like the moon, a great and bright light, but one that is still subservient to Saturn. These theories point to ancient myths such as the Romans have of Saturn being the original god before later being defeated by the younger gods representing other planets. In the myths of Saturn, he was said to rule over a golden and prosperous age, and even into the Common Era, there were cultic myths about the age of Saturn returning. Supposedly, Saturn in our sky would look like this image here from the cover of the Saturn Myth by Talbot, a book that details the ancient myths and imagery that supposedly point to the planet Saturn actually being our polar star. As you can see, the planet itself creates an O with its great ring around Saturn, and the light that bounces off of it creates the illusion of an A. Blavatsky is likely not the first person to use the idea that the ancients worshipped the planet Saturn when it was closer to the Earth, and instead her attempt to include it as a code in the details of her book was an attempt to share another secret society's supposed secrets without breaking her own oaths not to share them. The O and the A appear to be used by the show to allude to this great secret, which in a dramatic moment of Season 4 would likely have been seen on screen, with it being presented as a sci-fi TV moment in the context of Dimension 4. This conspiracy theory gained more popularity in the early 1900s, when Western occultists started creating their own mystic orders, such as the Fraterni Saturni in Germany, which hold the belief that Saturn was in fact our polar sun deep in humanity's past. The O and the A has become a sort of modern symbol for people who hold this belief to use in all sorts of media such as TV shows, but it is particularly noticeable in another show called The Outer Range, which uses the O and the A in its logo to make the same shape shape that the O and the A combine to make when representing Saturn. The Outer Range is a mysterious sci-fi show, and while I have not seen it all, it opens with the narrator asking the question, do you know the Greek god Kronos, who is of course the Greek parallel to the Roman god Saturn, talking about how Kronos, or Saturn, had to separate the spiritual from the physical. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, there was an explosion of various groups, all claiming to have long-lost mystic knowledge of the past, many of them taking inspiration from previous mystery schools, but clearly inventing a lot of new mythology that didn't seem to circulate in any of the prestigious mystery schools that came before. It would seem to me that the Saturn myth itself is rather cultic and not true, and uses a misunderstanding of mythology, which was much more tribal, and tries to apply those narratives that didn't fit the exact motions of stars to a retroactive history of how our solar system supposedly operated. While I imagine the Saturn myth to not actually be true, it has become a lie that is a symbol for the truth, just as mythology itself is. It represents the search for the mystical and grand while studying the truth of human history and nature. Blavatsky's secret society, Theosophy, has the mantra, "There is no religion higher than the truth," with which there's an accompanied image that combines many ancient symbols that Talbot connects to Saturn in his later Saturn myth book, putting the truth right in front of you in the form of symbols, with the truth that these symbols claim to allude to themselves not really being truth, but rather being a symbol for the greater truth that we are trying to understand through the mysteries. This will hopefully be my final breakdown on the OA, but as many of you have noticed from my recent videos, I will be posting more content here on the channel, often in the same vein as what is discussed in this video, including dedicated mythological breakdowns, as well as deconstructions of other media with similar themes. Leave any questions or concepts or topics you'd like me to discuss down in the show, or different TV shows or movies to break down. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss it. See you guys next time.